Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. Today, we're talking about a really interesting topic. Why is it that women are more likely to initiate divorce than men? So, looking at statistics, it actually shows that as much as 70% of divorces are initiated by women. And I see it all the time in my practice. And actually, even in situations where the man has cheated, it'll sometimes still be the woman who decides to call it quits because she can't stay in that marriage. So, to help us understand a little bit what might be behind the statistics and some of the dynamics at play, I've invited Anne Heaton-Armstrong. Anne is a BACP registered mental health counselor, and she specializes in empowerment. Anne's job is really to help people navigate life stages and transitions from a position of strength. Welcome, Anne. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Chloe. It's lovely to be here.
It's quite a meaty topic, but I'd love to get your view, as a counselor who works a lot with women who are making these important decisions. What factors do you think contribute to women being particularly dissatisfied in marriages? Or do you think it's just that they're equally dissatisfied, but they're more likely to make the decision that men somehow don't want to make?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think in order to answer that question, we need to kind of set the scene and look at what's happened over the past 100 years in terms of women's roles in society and in particular marriage. And so if you think of, we've over the past 100 years, we've achieved economic independence. We can now have careers and earn our own money, and that's a big thing. So that financial stability is a massive part of how women move in the world now compared to how they did even 50, let alone 100 years ago. We also have political emancipation. We have the vote since the 1920s. And so we can influence legislation and policies that impact us. So, again, another sort of cumulative effect that has happened over the last 100 years. And finally, the other thing to point at is that, we have control of our own fertility.
Yes.
And that's a big thing. In 1961, the NHS made the pill available to women. And so suddenly women have control of how many children they can have, when they can have them. And of course, that's not to say that this is all very easy. Anybody who's actively tried to have children has found that, it isn't always it's something that you can plan out. However, broadly speaking, these are aspects of life where women were beholden to men 100 years ago, and now they are a lot more independent, and in some cases completely independent from men in those regards. So yes, I think it's important to sort of absorb that when we're looking at these
Yeah.
issues. And what's really interesting is a few years ago, a group of scientists decided to do that, and they looked at all these trends, and they reviewed all the literature that was out there on why women choose divorce, and why do they initiate divorce. And what they found was this mismatch between women's evolved preferences and desires and what modern marriage is currently offering them. And so, of course, like we say, women's roles have changed so much, and then and marriage almost hasn't kept up. So we can see how these mismatches unfold in several realms, but I think there are a couple that are particularly significant that tend to show up in the counselling office, and I'm sure in your office too. And so one of these areas, or one of these mismatches, we're going to call the mate preference mismatch. And so when we look at what women look for in a partner, ancestrally, we've looked for two things. We've looked for good genes, because we want our children to survive and be strong and, be able to run away from lions and all that sort of thing. And then we also look for, status within the group. And what that looked like in the past would have been, strong men who could, fight off other men from other tribes, so the status. And what that looks like now is very interesting. Well, it's pretty much the same thing. And so we want good looks, and we want, financial prospects. That's what women want. And what's interesting is that, of course, as women's own financial prospects have increased, well, our bar has got kind of higher. And
Yeah, yeah.
so, we still want the good looking man with, with the money. And so, what I think is absolutely fascinating is you may have come across this TikTok that's doing the rounds, and it's called "I'm Looking for a Man in Finance." Have you heard about that?
Tell me about it.
Okay, so you have to look this up. It's by this girl called a young woman called Megan Bonney, and she created this TikTok because that, among her girlfriends and other young women on TikTok, she was seeing a lot of complaining about, oh, I can't find a boyfriend. And then when you dug deeper, they had this long laundry list of sort of, but I want him to do this and that and that and that and that. And she's saying kind of like, well, your
Might
expectations
be
are a bit
why
on
you
the
haven't
high
found
side.
somebody.
Exactly. And so the TikTok goes, it's very, very quick. And actually, you must look it up. But it says, I'm looking for a man in finance, trust fund, 6 foot, blue eyes. That says it all, really, doesn't it? They're absolutely fascinating. Yeah,
Interesting that those constructs also are still out there. I mean, I think there's always been this idea that in fairy tales and all that, the man's going to come and save you, and that he's somehow going to be this charming prince who's going to then take away all your problems. And I wonder if that's a bit of part of the problem as well, with men's expectation of a marriage being pretty much aligned to what they're being sold, but from women's not at all. And so is there
exactly.
possibly more disappointment when reality hits, that actually it isn't that fairy tale?
I think that's true. And I think, as women's own circumstances have improved,
Hmm.
they set the bar higher. And what happens is that the available pool of mates is shrinking for women because they have these very high expectations. And so at some point women start making compromises and they say,
Yeah.
okay, well, I'll go for the good looking chap, you know, but perhaps he doesn't earn as much money. And
Hmm.
then a few years down the line, that's really quite difficult. And
Hmm.
you've got a couple of children, and you're juggling a demanding career with the housework and the children, and caregiving responsibilities effectively. you know Maybe it kind of loses its luster a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
And then I
yeah,
wonder if there's an element as well of kind of the women's body and the transitions that we go through. First of all, we live a lot longer than men. So is there an element of us knowing that there's, another 30, 40 years ahead of us? And actually, do I really want to remain married to this guy for this long? Because we know that we're going to outlive them probably. But also, elements, events in our life like menopause and things like that, that also have an impact in women making those decisions, because they are in a transition in their life. And actually, it makes sense to reevaluate their entire life at that time.
absolutely. And I don't want to go off too much in a tangent because I did want to talk about this at some point, but it's kind of come up. So I'll go through it and then we'll go back to, to the mismatches. So what's really interesting is that there is an established sort of curve, sort of life satisfaction curve that you may have heard of before. And the idea is that human beings follow a U-shaped curve in terms of their life satisfaction. So it starts off up here, and in youth, and you're broadly satisfied and pretty happy with your life, and then it kind of goes down, 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 down till you hit middle age, and then things are really,
Bottom of the
it's the
curve.
pits. Exactly. So, but the good news is that life satisfaction then starts to improve. And actually, by the time you reach old age, you're at an all-time high. It's brilliant. So it's worth hanging in there, you know. And so I think what's interesting is that when you look at levels of life satisfaction for unmarried people, they definitely follow that U curve. Now, if you look
Yeah.
at life satisfaction levels for people who are married, they still follow that U curve, but it's
Hmm.
a little bit less pronounced. So
Okay.
marriage, just the fact of being married, provides a protective effect against
Yeah.
those difficult middle-aged years, which of course are when the menopause hits, when we have teenage children, which everybody knows can be a challenge,
Yeah.
and then perhaps when careers are getting particularly demanding. And so it's a
Hmm.
confluence of all these pressures. And
Yeah.
so yes, I think that if you're in a relationship where you're well supported, you know that's going to help you navigate those years, and you're going to
Yeah.
see your marriage as a positive addition to your life. Whereas if you have the opposite situation, you may not see it that way. You may start to think, I need to start cutting my losses here.
Yeah.
And so it should be brutal. But one thing that I wanted to add that's really fascinating, and when I looked at the research on this, was for those people, so you've got the sort of unmarried people, over here. Then you have the married people over here, sort of a softer curve. And then you've got the people who've married their best friends. Wow.
Okay.
These people, for them, the additional benefit for being married is much bigger than it is for ordinarily married people.
Okay.
So marry your best friend is the moral of the story.
It's interesting. So the romantic marriage is actually less sturdy than the one that's really built on a foundation of friendship.
Friendship. Yes,
Interesting.
absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. And then
So
you mentioned earlier as well, the economic elements. I think with women now having much more financial independence, they're able to make
yeah,
decisions they simply couldn't afford to make before. It's not that they didn't necessarily want to, but they just couldn't
right.
afford to leave their husbands. Are you seeing that as a big factor in people making that decision?
I think it definitely comes into play. And I think it's difficult to make generalizations, because one of the things that we must remember that a lot of the research, is very culturally biased
Mm.
and socioeconomically biased. It can be as well. Not always, but certainly culturally biased. And so what applies in one cultural context in one part of the world may actually unfold in a completely different way somewhere else. But if we're looking at sort of the Western world and the available research, certainly, certainly women's financial wherewithal seems to be a part of the equation for sure. But that brings me to another aspect, where, the study I was telling you about, where they reviewed all the literature on why women divorce. So they also looked at other aspects of where there were mismatches. And another aspect is in the sort of more domestic realm, the sort of caregiving responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so, we've got women who have ancestrally taken care of the home and, taken care of the children, and that's continued. And of course,
Yeah.
we've arrived at this sort of economic emancipation point in time, which, when you look at the history of humanity, it's a tiny, tiny little dot. However, that's where we are right now. We're in that dot. And so we've achieved this economic independence, but we haven't really shifted our caregiving responsibilities. So women are now juggling career, and we're also juggling our, long-standing responsibility for the home and as caregivers. And so it's a lot,
Yeah.
and it's very easy to kind of say, oh, well, those horrible men aren't helping us. But actually, it's not as straightforward as that. There are many men, and in fact, I would argue increasing numbers of men, who are very interested in being involved with caregiving. However, we have a society that is not structured to support that.
That's true.
And so one of the interesting things that I read on a UNICEF report recently was that paternity leave, which in those countries that provide it, averages at 1 or 2 weeks. One or
Yeah.
two weeks.
Yeah.
Paternity leave constitutes 10% of total leave.
Hmm.
10%. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And paternity leave is so important because it facilitates bonding between the
Absolutely.
father and the children, and we know that bonding then increases, your levels of connection with a child. It makes you with another human being, and it makes you want to care for that human being
Yeah.
proactively. And so it's hugely important. But it's not only that, because of course men bond with their children. That's, it does still happen even if they have to go to work. However, structurally, when we look at, the ability to be physically present to help out with that, or to help out, to do their share. I don't like to say to help out because we're not being helped, are
Yeah.
we? But no, to do their part of looking after that child. It's actually very difficult. Men still face a lot of stigma if they take time off work,
Yeah.
where they're not supported necessarily, or they're put under pressure to return back to work as soon as possible. And that's just anecdotally. I mean, at the end of the day, having paternity leave supports that redistribution of caregiving duties be between partners, as well as it allows for people to look at how the household is run, and maybe now we do things differently. Maybe now
Yeah.
the father's going to take care of the laundry, whereas before he maybe did something so you start to, but you need to have that time available for as a couple to be able to come together without distractions, and just focus on what your family unit needs. And I think that then sets you up for a really good foundation going forward. As a
Yeah.
society, we're not even providing that first point, and
Sure.
that's really difficult.
And then you're also starting off on the wrong basis, because if it's only the woman who takes time off with maternity leave, then from the very offset she's the sole caregiver for the child. She also stays at home and doesn't go to work. All of those patterns get set from that very beginning.
Well
So
said.
you're
Yes,
not setting
exactly.
yourself up for success, really.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And yes, and it's as you say, those patterns get established early on, and once a pattern is established, is it's easy to do. The easy option, even when it's difficult, the easy option is to just follow the pattern,
Yeah.
right? Just
Yeah,
keep doing
and then
what
I
you've
guess it
always
comes
done.
back to my very first question around, whether women tend to be more dissatisfied, or is it just that they have more, courage to make that decision? There is definitely an element of dissatisfaction in the sense that there is this feeling that we have to do it all, and I think in that sense, women have been missold, and they're not. It's not properly portrayed, in the media and in popular culture, that there is that constant juggle, especially if you're working at the same time, but even if you're not, in terms of trying to be on every front and having to carry all those different loads, and a sense, I guess, of resentment towards the man, who tends to be more focused on his career and himself, and then the family comes second. Do you see a lot of that?
Yeah. I think that can definitely play a part. And I do agree that there can be that sense that women are doing it all, and for some women, if they're not, if they feel like their relationship isn't fulfilling or satisfying, they don't have that friendship element with their other halves, then it very quickly starts to erode, and very quickly, like I said before, they start to cut their losses, and they think, well,
Yeah.
financially, I'm not going to be destitute. I can cope. I think that anecdotally, I would also add that, women are social creatures. That's just a
Yeah.
fact. It's the way we've evolved. It's what's kept us going. We are constantly relying on our social skills, to get through life. And I think these come into play during and after divorce quite a lot. And so when a woman contemplates, for example, okay, so how am I going to cope with, the school run? Perhaps my husband used to do the pickups, or whatever, or the drop-offs, or whatever. They can now sort of say, okay, well, my friend who lives down the road, maybe she can pick up the children on a Monday and a Wednesday, and I can pick her children up on a Tuesday and Thursday. I'm sure she'll be up for that. And you kind of have connections, and you sort of you're well set up. And in fact, there's evidence for this. And so there are studies that have shown that whilst women suffer from the consequences of divorce, for women, the economic consequences of divorce for women can be quite dire.
Yes, and
And
they're worse than for
women
men,
are,
actually.
yes, absolutely, and
Yeah.
women can be at higher risk of entering poverty as a consequence of divorce, for example. So these are serious things. But on the flip side, when you look at the consequences of divorce for men, the areas in which they appear to be more vulnerable are health and well-being. They're more likely to adopt poor lifestyle habits.
Yeah.
you know, and social relationships, you know, so their levels of life satisfaction with family life, for example, can drop quite a bit, and they can be, you know, they can be very vulnerable in that respect. Things, their levels of satisfaction with custodial arrangements tend to be, you know, less satisfying for men than for women. Levels of loneliness and levels of social isolation, you know, a lot of men eventually depend on, you know, they can get absorbed in their careers, and that can be their sort of main focus, you know, to the detriment of their social connections sometimes, and often men can rely on their wives and their
Yeah.
wives' extended network for their social lives, you
Yeah.
know, and so when that goes away, suddenly that isolation really hits.
Yeah.
So I think that you know, when women contemplate the idea of divorce, and they play in their minds, okay, how would I cope?
Yeah.
They look at it very much from a social perspective, um, in terms of their skills and resources.
Yeah.
But also now, as a whole, we have the added benefit that we can say, well, you know, we have careers, we
Yeah.
have financial wherewithal, and maybe I won't be as well off as I was while I was married, but it'll be good enough. You know, I can
Yeah.
see how I'll be able to make ends meet. So I think that we have, in some ways, less to lose.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, on that point actually, and I think we mentioned that when we were preparing for this podcast, is there's still this conception, which isn't actually that true anymore, but that women will get to keep the children. And I wonder whether that plays a role in making the decision as well, because in that sense, a man would have more to lose than a woman if he feels that he might no longer have as much access to his children, whereas the woman might be quite secure in the fact that she will be able to have her children most of the time.
Exactly, yes. And I think there is that misconception or misperception that that women automatically get the children.
Yeah.
And maybe that emboldens women, and maybe it makes men a little bit more reluctant. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And so, from what your experience, I guess, working with women, do you feel that emotional fulfillment is a big part of the decision to divorce when women are making that decision, or is it more of a calculated approach, looking at, can I sustain myself financially? How much will I see my children? All of those more practical elements.
Yes, I mean, I think it depends, you know, on individual circumstances for sure. So I don't think you can make general sweeping generalizations. I see a variety of motivations behind divorce, to be honest. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that the emotional fulfillment is definitely significant for women. I mean, we've talked about the U-shaped curve of life satisfaction, and how, you know, friendship within a marriage is a big insulating factor against those difficult times. Um, but I think, on the other hand, you know, if there's domestic abuse in the family, and I think it's something like, I haven't looked at the statistics recently, but I think it's something like a quarter of divorces have some element of abuse.
Yes.
And so, I mean, that's a very high figure. And so, you know, there are times when divorce is mere survival, right? So
Yeah.
you know, whether you're going to be able to um, juggle the finances seems so secondary when you're thinking, I need to get myself out of this situation. I need to get my children out of this situation.
Yeah.
So I think it varies for sure. Yeah.
Last question, which is kind of flipping all this on its head, but when you
Yeah.
work with men who are contemplating divorce, what kind of narrative do you hear that makes them actually reluctant, or that tends to make them reluctant, again, to avoid sweeping generalizations? But what would be, the concern behind men making that decision?
Well, again, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but I would say that fear of
Mhm.
loneliness, is a big part.
Interesting.
And that is reflected in the literature. Like I say, you know, men tend to fare worse in terms of social connections
Mhm.
and health and well-being, you know,
Yeah.
after a divorce. And so, even though, interestingly, they are more likely to marry after divorce,
Yes, they are. Yeah.
but you know, this is what the
Maybe that's
statistics
why,
are telling.
because they need to
And
fill that void. Yeah.
yeah, and maybe they repeat patterns. You know, maybe men if they're quicker I mean, I think if you're faster to remarry, then it stands to reason that you might not be taking the time to really figure out what you want going forward.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
mean, again, that's a generalization. You have to really look at individual. Honestly, in counseling, I think I'm always very reluctant to make generalizations because
Mhm.
each human being is a universe.
Absolutely.
That's really, really true. But yes,
They
it's
all
it's
come to see
interesting to
you
see
with
the
their own baggage, their own story, and their own feelings.
yes, yeah, yeah,
Such an interesting topic. We could go on forever. I think it is hard
yeah.
to address it without making generalizations because we are talking about groups of people rather than individuals. But it's really interesting to see that there is that pattern and that the statistics are showing really that discrepancy. So thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for joining me today.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you so much.